Hey Python pioneers, welcome to another video. In the last video we talked about functions and we left off saying that we were going to talk about uh, the none value. What is none? So one of the things that I said in the functions video, I said that every function must return something, right? And if you write a function that maybe just prints and you don't ever use the word return in your function, uh, you end up with Python returning none for you. So what is none? Just like with true and false, you have to capitalize the N and you type out the word none. Okay? So you can define a variable and say, my var equals none. It's just basically, in other programming languages, they call it nil or null. It's just nothing. It equals nothing. And so if you write a function and let's say we call it, print hello, right? And I say print hello. Simple enough. When I call this function, if I assign the value of it to a variable, and let's say I just create one called myVar equals print hello, and I print out the value that's stored in myVar, it actually will be none. So let's try that. See, it prints hello, and then whenever it's called, we don't ever provide a return in our function. So by default, none is returned. So my var is set to none. Actually, you can see this. We don't even have to define our own function. So if we just say my var equals print hello, the print function itself also would return none. But I need to actually print out my var so you can see what's stored in it. None. So that's the none value, and it'll become more useful as we go on, but it's worth bringing up now as you're writing functions. If you ever write a function and then you're trying to assign the value that function's supposed to return, and for some reason the value in the variable that you're storing it in is set to none, you probably messed up somewhere in your function and didn't return a value. Okay, let's jump on to the next thing. We kind of talked about scope in the last video, but I wanted to really give it some time and have its own video dedicated to scope, because it's something that can take a minute to wrap around your head. So think of scope as a container for variables, right? So each scope has variables that are defined in it, and each scope can access other scopes or it can't. But how do you determine if it can or can't? Well, there's two types of scope. There's the global scope and the local scope. The global scope is created when your program begins, and anything that you define outside of a function is part of the global scope. And the local scope is created when a function is called. So when you define a function, it has a local scope. So for example, down here we have def spam, and we have a variable called eggs, and we set it to 31337. When this function is called, the scope for that function is created technically, and the variables are created inside of that scope, and then when the function ends, so does that scope. Code in the global scope, or code in the global scope outside of all functions cannot be used with any local variables. So for example, if we have a function called spam, and this is coming straight from Automate the Boring Stuff. And by the way, I didn't mention in the last video, but if you haven't already, go ahead and read chapter 3 of Automate the Boring Stuff. That's where we really dive into defining your own functions, and it talks about scope as well. And that's actually where these examples came from. So I'm just talking with you about them. So def spam And inside of that, we have a local scope called eggs, where we set 31337 as the value. And we call spam. So you would think, oh, maybe I can print the value of eggs right here, but you can't do that. So if I run that code, I get the error name eggs is not defined, because eggs was created in a local scope that was destroyed when the function spam finished. So spam gets called here, it goes up, creates the eggs variable, 31337 is set as the value, but then we do nothing with it. The function ends, eggs is destroyed. When we try to print eggs, it doesn't know what we're talking about, right? So what I'm doing here, by the way, I'm just creating a multi-line string with three quotes. You could do single or double. And that's just like a way to comment out stuff, really. You could do it if you need to comment out a bunch of stuff all at once. You could just use 3 quotes, and it's kind of nice. So code in the local scope can access global variables. So that's the opposite, right? The global scope can't access local variables, but local scope variables or local scope program can access the global variables. So what does that look like? And I'm just going to comment these out actually, so we don't have to type them again. So if I have a variable called eggs and I set it to 42, notice it's not inside of a function. So that means it's part of the global scope. If I call this function spam, it's going to jump up. Oh, here's spam. Okay, what do? I just print eggs. Okay, so if I run that, it will actually work. It will print 42 because we can access the values stored in global variables. We can't change them without using that global keyword we talked about, but we can just access them without even having to pass in the value as an argument. So local scope can access global scope, but global scope cannot access local scope. All right, so code in a function's local scope cannot use variables in another local scope. So what does that mean? Let's see what that looks like. Comment that out and that out. So if we have some function called spam and some function called bacon, we call spam, right? Spam sets eggs equal to 99 and bacon is called. So at this point, spam stops running. It kind of holds right there and it goes and runs bacon. We have ham equals 101, eggs equals 0. So you might think that this value right here for the eggs variable will be set to 0, but it won't. What happens is these are 2 separate local scopes. So the eggs variable is recreated down here and set to 0. When the bacon function ends, this variable is destroyed. And then we come back up, bacon is done running, and we print eggs. So when we run this program, eggs will print as 99. See, you might have thought that eggs would have been 0 because we tried to change it, but right, it can't change that way because it's a separate local scope. Okay, so let's jump down to the next one. Comment out the quotes. You can use the same name for different variables if they are in different scopes. So this is an example that is confusing, but it shows a point. So I have 2 functions, spam and bacon again, and I have a global variable called eggs. We set the value to global, and then we call the bacon function. So we jump up, we're in the bacon function. We create a new local variable called eggs, and we set it to bacon local. And we print the value. That will print bacon local. Then we call spam. So bacon function holds exactly where it is and goes and runs the spam function. We create a new local variable called eggs and we set it to spam local because it's a spam function. We print the value. So that will print spam local. So far we printed bacon local, spam local. Spam finishes. we return back to bacon where span was called, and we jump to the next line and we print eggs, which will just print bacon local again, because we never changed the value of this local version of eggs. Then the bacon function ends, we jump back to where it was called, and we run the next line of code, and we print eggs, which will print global. So when we run this program, it should print bacon local, spam local, bacon local, global. If we run that, that is what we see. So you can have the same name across scopes. You can use the same variable name, but generally try to avoid that unless it's not going to be confusing. So if you're using some kind of count variable, that might be fine, but just be careful with how you name things so that when you're reading your code, it's not confusing. Okay, and that covers scope and the none value. In the next video, we're going to learn about how to handle exceptions, and that's a really nice one. So I'm excited to show you that one, but for now, that's the end of this video. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you next.